Okay, let's get started, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tuesday, December 15th, 2020. My name is Lisa Onaga, and I'm really pleased to welcome you here to the fourth and last Institute's Colloquium of the year here at the Max-Planck-Institut for the History of Science. Our topic of this year's series is Crisis and Capacity, Perspectives in the Humanities and Social Sciences. And we've been highlighting various scholars within and in relation to the history of science to reflect on what the pandemic means for doing research right here, right now. Since our last meeting, vaccines have become an even larger topic, and vaccines have begun distributions for healthcare workers. And this has highlighted additional questions about how people in various communities will have access to these vaccines, whether it's in Berlin, somewhere in Europe, or somewhere else in the world. So today's theme is historicizing ableism and ageism, and it variegates such basic questions about the pandemic by looking more deeply at diverse subgroups, the disabled and the elderly, within that broad umbrella of what we call communities. Today, we're excited to be joined by two special guests, Drs. Aparna Nair and Lara Coyk, to discuss their research at the forefront of these topics. In this year's Colloquium series, we bring together researchers who are looking at different parts of the world to help us piece together deeper and broader understandings about the role of history of science for making sense of COVID-19 and possibly vice versa. So I will introduce each speaker for their 20-minute micro lectures, and that will be followed by their one-on-one discussion. We are recording the talks and the panel discussion of the speakers only. We'll then conclude the recorded part and invite everybody to turn on their cameras and open up the floor for a Q&A that will be moderated by our co-coordinator, Stephanie Hood. So please check out the Etherpad link, which we will put into the chat box, and you can queue up there for questions. And if you like to just write out your question anonymously, you're welcome to do that too. And in the Ethernet pad, we have listed useful links to the Institute's Colloquium Intranet Library corner. For those of you who are networked in the Institute, you can take a look at all of their publications there. So I'm honored to introduce our first speaker today, who is based farthest away from Berlin right now. Dr. Aparna Nair is currently assistant professor at the History of Science department at the University of Oklahoma, where she teaches courses ranging from the history of public health, introduction to disability studies, to non-Western and indigenous medicine and science and empire. She combined her MPH training from the Harvard Change School of Public Health with a PhD training in history and demography from Australian National University to study the history of disease, death, and public health in the context of the East India Company's colonization of southern India. Before moving to Oklahoma, Dr. Nair taught at the Georg August Universität and the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum, Kerala, India. Over the years, she has developed an expertise in the historical relationship between disability and colonialism in British India. The range of this work is quite formidable, spanning matters of personhood and gender through the study of prosthetics and the rehabilitation among disabled sepoys of the First World War. Examples of her work appear in Social History of Medicine. And the histories of public health are another aspect of her research, focusing on quarantine, matters of smallpox vaccination in India, and also epilepsy in modern South India. And this work is appearing in Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. Dr. Nair's work also involves disability and chronic illness in popular culture, especially focusing on epilepsy, and she is currently putting the finishing touches on her manuscript titled Fungible Bodies, Disability Histories of British India, 1850 to 1950. And this will be appearing in the University of Illinois Press's series on disability history. And now there's many other things I can mention here, but one of the notable things about Dr. Nair's work is a strong commitment to outreach. She's the 2019 recipient of the Oklahoma University's Social Justice Award, recipient of the Patent Teaching Award of 2019, and she has a stellar track record of public engagement with contributions regularly to the Wellcome Trust stories and almost annually producing amazing exhibits on history of science with students at Oklahoma, and to the open access blog project on gender and medicine nursing Clio. You can find her work there as well. In this spirit, Dr. Nair's micro lecture, Centering Disability in a Pandemic, will highlight examples from the histories of medicine, public health, and disability studies to make visible the double issue of COVID-19 as something that has impacted people disproportionately, and will also likely leave disabled survivors in its wake. So a lot of people will suffer these long-term ill effects, which are only beginning to be understood. So thank you so much for joining us early this morning from Norman, Oklahoma. Dr. Nair, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Lisa, for that extraordinarily generous introduction. I hope to live up to it, at least some of it. I have changed the title of my talk, which happens all the time. It is now Historicizing Ableism, Lessons from a Pandemic. I would like to thank the MPI and Lisa and Stephanie especially for the invitation, and to all of you for being here to listen to this talk. We are in the middle of an unprecedented global public health crisis, and as a historian of public health, I have found my discipline in the public limelight consistently this year as people have tried to use history to make sense of the past. But equally, I've been struck this year that, the argument of historians like Charles Rosenberg and others, that epidemics and pandemics put pressure on the societies they impact and reveal existing, not always tangible fractures and fissures, is particularly relevant. This has been painfully evident to historians of disability and disability advocates in disabled communities across the world, as the pandemic has unmasked, no pun intended, how obvious, enduring, and pernicious ableism becomes in a crisis like this one. The easiest way to see this ableism is in terms of the demographic and epidemiological impact of the pandemic. On slide 2, for instance, I list a few of these these statistics just to give you a sense of this. Right, second slide, yeah. So the Office of National Statistics in the UK published a report in fall which demonstrated that close to 60% of the people who died of COVID in England and Wales between March and July were disabled. Similar results have come from Australian studies which reveal that COVID-19 in institutional settings was not only killing disabled people in these institutions, but that it was a driver of infections to the wider community as well. In the US, consistently, we've been able to prove the impact of, demonstrate how disability is an important way to understand the pandemic. Intellectually disabled and autistic people are experiencing high mortality rates. Not only that, developmentally disabled people in the US, according to a recent study, while being less likely to become infected, when they did become infected, had a significantly higher risk of dying than non-disabled people, especially if they were in institutional care settings or partially institutional care settings. In general, in the US, nursing homes and institutions for the disabled account for 40% of the nation's truly substantial death toll from COVID-19. The Global Disability Rights Monitor Survey also tracks grave and systematic violations of the rights of disabled people in 50 countries in large and small institutions. My intent with this slide is not to beat you over the head with statistics, but to give you a sense of exactly why disability matters when we try to understand exactly what the pandemic is doing to disabled people across the world. And before I go any further, I have to do the sensible thing and do a little housekeeping. Every scholar who works on disability has to and must acknowledge that the definition of disability can and often is very elusive. It has changed over time. It's socially constructed and culturally variable. And yet we use it as an analytical framework, as a category of social difference, while acknowledging this difficulty of definition. I tend to stick with Sherry's definition of disability listed on the slide: impairment as a biological, cognitive, sensory, or psychological difference, which is usually diagnosed or framed in the medical context, and disability as a negative social reaction to these differences. And since I'll be using the word ableism in this little mini lecture, I thought I'd give you a small definition of exactly what I mean by ableism and what disableism is. Many of you may have also heard the use of disableism in British and European scholarship on disability. In America, it's less common, but I thought I'd define it anyway. The two definitions here are from Fiona Kumari Campbell, and ableism essentially is a set of beliefs, processes, and practices that produces and privileges a particular kind of self and body as a corporeal standard, what Rosemary Garland Thompson defined as the normate, essentially. And disableism is a set of conscious or unconscious assumptions that foster the different or unequal treatment of people with disabilities. These are just the definitions. We can come back to this later. Next slide. My questions for this mini lecture were basically, how do we examine the relationships between diseases like COVID and disability, especially as as Lisa said, we're beginning to see some light at the end of the tunnel. How do we unpack how ableism has operated in the past, and what does it tell us about this particular moment? I will do this in three ways, and the first thing I'm going to focus on is ableist narratives and their precedents. Next slide. Throughout the pandemic, in fact, ever since it began, ableist narratives of the disease and public health policies in response to the disease have been circulating in public discourse, in media, and it seems to be quite influential. The perfect iteration of this is, of course, the much misunderstood concept of herd immunity by infection, which I'm sure all of you have heard of by now. Several people have openly advocated herd immunity by infection as a public health and state response to the pandemic. It was not just a speculation of the fever dreams of the internet. It was pitched and supported by scientists who had the ears of politicians. For example, in the US, Scott Atlas, the scientist of the Great Barrington Declaration, and in Sweden, Anders Tegnell. For politicians who did not want to lock down or wanted to take a laissez-faire approach to the pandemic, this was exactly what they wanted to hear. And it's fair to say that herd immunity by infection has actually permeated popular understandings of COVID and of immunity. So what does it reveal about our beliefs about what we believe about disability? What most people seem not to understand is when they advocate for herd immunity by infection, they're essentially arguing that the deaths of the vulnerable populations, the elderly, the disabled, that will inevitably result are acceptable losses, right? And in addition to which, the narratives around COVID have also framed disabled people as lesser or diminished lives that are burdens on the social, economic, and healthcare system. So it's not really surprising that for millions of disabled people across the world, this discursive and policy toying with herd immunity by infection has produced fear, alarm, and a distressing sense of deja vu. Next slide, please. I'd like to track some of the genealogies of these ideas and situate it, if possible, within a longer history. The idea of disease as checking population growth is, of course, of long-standing. I did my PhD in a demography department, and we read quite a few texts that articulated this quite clearly. Thomas Robert Malthus is perhaps the one that I should mention. Malthus believed that disease acted as a positive check on population growth, knocking it back down to sustainable levels into balance with existing resources like war and famine. Moving forward several decades, Darwin also discussed how the actions of philanthropy, the state, and public health were actually preserving thousands who otherwise would have died of disease. So here we see the demographic understanding of disease anchored to Darwinian ideas of natural selection as well. Next slide, please. Following in the wake of Darwin, social Darwinists and eugenicists had certainly a complicated understandings of the relationship between disease and disability. But as Martin Pernick pointed out, many eugenicists actually regarded disease as a eugenic force, as nature's way of weeding out the unfit from society. A perfect example of this is the very influential US eugenicist Charles Davenport's statement that the artificial preservation of those whom the operation of natural agencies tends to eliminate may conceivably destroy the race. The corollary of disease as a eugenic force is that public health, or anything we do to preserve the health of people from disease, is potentially dysgenic. Now, I'm not arguing that eugenics, and public health did not work hand in hand. Later on, the relationship between disease and disability in eugenics is far more complicated. Public health draws significantly on eugenic ideas in the 19th and 20th century, and eugenics itself uses justifications of population health to justify many of its policies. Next slide, please. But the parallels in the language are certainly striking and worth noting. The notion of disability as somewhere between a burden and an acceptable loss was everywhere this year. And I would just like to say that when we discuss herd immunity by infection as a viable response to the pandemic, which I hope will not be happening anymore, what we are doing is nothing short of describing COVID-19 as a eugenic force and public health interventions as dysgenic, essentially. What you're seeing on the right here is a letter that was written by a Welsh surgery to chronically ill and disabled patients in April of 2020. And it in the UK, do not attempt CPR forms have to be filled out by physicians, not patients. And the surgery essentially asked its chronically ill and disabled patients that resources will be scarce and that they had to be frank and realistic, and that the existing resources should be targeted to the young and fit who had a greater chance of surviving the infection. It became quite a scandal, but I think the language is especially telling and connects with older narratives of eugenics and social Darwinism and Malthusian ideas about disease. The second kind of point that I wanted to make, next slide, please, is the rest of my lecture is going to be focused primarily on institutionalized disabled people. The vulnerability of disabled people in institutional care settings in the context of COVID to structural ableism is a part of a really long history. Indeed, throughout the 20th and 19th and 20th centuries, asylums usually made it into newspapers, often as part of sensational exposés of conditions in the asylums. Bad food, dirty water, people starving, fires, abusive attendance, sexual violence. All of these are part of the histories of institutionalization. And while medical historians have written about institutions as sites of medical and public health experimentation, disabled people have experienced these institutions very differently. For them, disabled people were not only forcibly incarcerated, in these spaces, their voices were also, it's also really hard to get a sense of their voices from archive records. Now, consistently, these institutions have been at the mercy of local circumstances, funding conditions, state and community interests. And in the US, institutions that were segregated, at least until the latter half of the 20th century, and asylums and institutions for Native and Black Americans were consistently worse off than those that catered to white populations. Next slide, please. I'm going to describe how this neglect and how this violence was pathologized in the context of the context of the institution. And the two diagnostic examples I draw on are going to be asylum year and asylum dysentery. Asylum year was also described as insane year, ethematoma or hematoma auris. However named, this diagnosis is actually evidence of the conditions that institutionalized disabled people lived in, as well as a really great example of the pathologization of neglect and violence. In the latter half of the 19th century, physicians wrote prodigiously about asylum year, not just in Europe, but also in India and in the Americas that I could find. I still haven't found mentions of it in Australia, but I'm looking. Friedrich Bird was actually one of the first to describe it. In 1833, he described asylum year in 6 male subjects in the Siegburg Asylum in Bonn. Symptoms were often sudden in onset and began with the reddening and inflammation of the ear, eventually darkening and hardening, resulting in a deformity that could be as large as an egg. This deformity could be temporary or permanent, depending on the severity of the condition. For us today, a useful comparison would be what is often described as boxers' ears or cauliflower ears in boxers. Even physicians writing in the 19th century noted that asylum year was very similar to the kinds of conditions noted in boxers, athletes, and soldiers. And it's also worth noticing that in the asylum spaces, it was almost always the left ear that was affected. What this may seem a small detail, but it actually underscores the rationale for traumatic etiologies of asylum year, because what it suggests is that the asylum resident was violently assaulted across the left ear, or had their ears severely pulled by the right hand of staff, nurses, or other inmates, causing asylum year. It seemed to be far commoner in men than women. And what is really interesting is how hesitant physicians and asylum superintendents across the world were to acknowledge that it was violence that was actually causing asylum year. So while asylum year, next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Right. While asylum year was emblematic of institutional ableism and violence, I would argue that we should also consider endemic and epidemic infectious diseases amongst historically institutionalized disabled people to help us understand this particular moment. Indeed, 19th and early 20th century sources across the world consistently reported the prevalence of a range of infectious diseases in institutionalized populations. This included diarrheal diseases, pneumonia, influenza, smallpox outbreaks even after vaccination became widespread, enteric fever, scarlet fever, measles, and diphtheria. In addition to the high prevalence of nutritional deficiency diseases, beriberi, pellagra, scurvy, these were all reported in institutional populations. This is, of course, not restricted to asylums. Disabled people institutionalized in epileptic or idiot colonies, schools for the blind and deaf, and institutions for the feeble-minded across the world, from Melbourne to Dhaka to Michigan to London, were all similarly vulnerable to these waves of disease, it would seem. And in general, these infections appear to be either produced by the conditions, sanitary and epidemiological, inside the institution, or they were imported into the institutionalized populations from outside, as is the case in the late 19th century, when you see a whole host of cholera infections across European asylums. Next slide, please. Physicians also pathologize neglect in institutionalized disabled populations through the diagnostic category of asylum dysentery. In the 19th century, this condition was observed in the Americas, Britain, mainland Europe, India, and Australia. Dysentery itself, or more specifically, the quite distinctive yet diagnostically elusive constellation of symptoms that comprise dysentery, has been linked to the violence of imperialism, to wars, want, and depredations. But it is clear that, at least for much of the 19th century, physicians understood asylum dysentery as a distinct and discrete disease category with a unique etiology. They saw it as different from tropical dysentery, and often argued that it did not have infectious etiologies, but instead was the cause of the caused by the weakened constitutions of disabled institutionalized people. Next slide, please. The symptoms of asylum dysentery actually sound very much like bacillary dysentery, without stepping into retrospective diagnosis. It started quickly with severe abdominal pain, fever, and bloody diarrhea, which could last for as long as 24 to 30 hours, in which case it most likely would be lethal. It was an agonizing and very difficult death, because attendants in asylums and institutions, refused to touch patients who had such severe asylum dysentery as well. It was also particularly virulent and tended to spread like wildfire through many institutionalized populations, and also sickened and killed employees as well. Now, many physicians did mention defective sanitation in trying to explain outbreaks, but in general, next slide, please. But in general, they saw asylum dysentery as a discrete diagnostic category, and it was only in the early 20th century that bacteriological investigations would reveal that asylum dysentery was actually caused by the Shigella bacterium. Why did I bring up asylum year and asylum dysentery? Because these two actually capture the corporeal experiences of disabled institutionalized people in the 19th and the 20th century. And it also, I think, really captures how physicians are often resistant to acknowledging ableism, neglect, and violence as factors in their diagnosis and in building their etiologies of disease. Next slide, please. My my conclusions for this lecture are quite simple. I hope that I've convinced you that disability matters as a category of social and historical analysis, and is not solely just another other or a trite form of identity politics. This year, especially, disabled people have routinely been told that they are disposable, that they are burdens on society, and that their rights are tertiary or secondary to non-disabled people. They've been marginalized, neglected, and left out of conversations on what to do in the face of a truly devastating pandemic. And that says a lot about what role we think disabled people play in everyday society. Additionally, I think physicians and public health practitioners often think of disabled people in terms of burdens on society, instead of the complex set of experiences that are determined by broader social, economic, political, and institutional factors. And I think one of the most dangerous ways that this manifests is when you have bioethical discussions of COVID-19 that have absolutely no engagement with disability studies or disability informed bioethics. And as large-scale vaccination programs begin as we speak today, I think it's never been more important for us to continue to center disability in the way we conceptualize and respond to the pandemic. That's it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nair, for that wonderful lecture, so illuminating. While we're transitioning from the first micro lecture to the next, I wanted to just take a moment to thank some key people who are working behind the scenes that make this event possible. Veriana Braun and Aaron Richmond from the communications team will be working with us through the winter to help make the videos from this year's Institute's colloquia available to the public. And we also wish to thank the library for their help in making the documents available for all of us to access. And we'd like to welcome and thank Pablo Ruiz de Alano, who is a research scholar here at the Max-Planck-Institut for the History of Science, who is joining us on the coordination team for next semester in particular. So It is my great pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Laura Coyk. And she's based here in Berlin and conducts research that lies at the intersection of history of science and philosophy of medicine. She currently holds a Branco Weiss Fellowship of the ETH Zurich and leads a junior research group at the Humboldt University of Berlin entitled Learning from Alzheimer's Disease, a History of Biomedical Models of Mental Illness. And this project dives deeply into the history of diagnosing Alzheimer's disease and how biomedical knowledge about mental illness has been formed and transformed in the long 20th century. The research of Dr. Coyk appears in publications such as History of the Human Sciences, History and Philosophy of the Life Sciences, and the volume Vagueness in Psychiatry, edited with Kyle and Hauswald, among others. Dr. Coyk studied molecular biomedicine at Bonn, and then received her doctorate in History, Philosophy, and Ethics of Medicine from Johannes Gutenberg Universität Mainz. And in this context, she studied the history of biomedical experimentation from mutant mice to medical classification systems and neuroscientific models. Dr. Coyk is also an alumnus of the Institute, having worked here before. And this summer in particular, she also worked with Stephanie and I to produce an excellent video for the History of Science on Cull project. And we'll also list these links in the chat box. These are available in English and German. So please check those out. As a recently elected member of the Junge Academy, it seems that Dr. Coyk will be very engaged in academic knowledge exchange in the Berlin community. And this, in fact, complements her upcoming move next year here to the MPIWG, where she will inaugurate a new Max-Planck research group, Practices of Validation in the Biomedical Sciences. So it's a treat today that we get to see a preview of her work in this talk about the history of ageism and epistemic injustices, where medical research and practice contribute to the problems for older adults. Given how Dr. Coyk's work explores new ways of historicizing disorder and disease by considering both the heterogeneity of biomedical research and the historical contingency of medical knowledge more generally, we asked Dr. Coyk to help put this historical perspective on ageism, something deeply entwined with her research on Alzheimer's disease and the disease in general, in relation to COVID-19 and how public health measures have been established or are being established as we speak to control the pandemic. So we're very much looking forward to your talk, Historicizing Ageism in Medicine, and for the discussion afterward. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, and thank you so much for this very kind introduction, and thank you all of you for zooming in. And also Aparna, thank you very much for your great talk. So since the topics and format of this colloquium are responses to the current health crisis, let me start with some reflections on the corona pandemic and its iterations with my research perspective. And I would like to do this on two levels. First, with regards to the topic of age and medicine, and second, with respect to methodological implications that stem out of our double role as participants and observers of the pandemic. So like one reason why Lisa and Stephanie wanted to include a contribution on the history of ageism is that the corona crisis has fostered age-related measures of various kinds. If you're over the usual retirement age, you're considered as belonging to a risk group, and in some countries have to obey to special confinement procedures because of your old age. Of course, there is some legitimacy in the idea to safeguard people who have a significantly elevated risk of dying. So how is the definition of risk groups based on age connected to the World Health Organization's definition of ageism as, quote, an insidious practice which has harmful effects on the health of older adults, unquote. Or to frame the question differently, what could be unjust about ordering populations according to age? So this problem might become more palpable if we look at young adults that have been labeled as non-obedient troublemakers and potential superspreaders of the coronavirus. Young age has at times been treated as a marker for a threat to older people's health. For instance, in Poland, young people under 18 have recently been prohibited to be outside without an accompanying adult. Here, classical prejudices against certain age groups re-emerge in parallel to the use of age as an objective variable to order, or to use the technical term, stratify populations. So in this case, ageism, the insidious practice which has harmful effects on health, has been tied to a medical sampling procedure, the stratification of a population according to age. And before I go into the details of the complicated relationship between medicine and medical procedures and ageism, let me say something about the methodological implications of our own concernedness in this health crisis. I want to do this with quoting the well-known motto of the oral history movement, dig where you stand. In the past months, we have become very sensitive to the fact that we stand on the same globally interconnected Earth, but on different grounds. And as the past speakers of this colloquium have outlined from various perspectives, we are all in this, yet the impacts on individual lives differ greatly according to where we live and which possibilities we are given. So for me, the question is, what does this collective but different experience of the pandemic mean for digging where we stand? What does it imply for our situatedness? And okay, so here's my take on adopting standpoint theory to a global crisis. I think that in the best case, we can make use of the first-person experience of being more or less affected by the corona pandemic to culture an ethical sensitivity for inequalities. Since my own research is directed towards epistemological questions positioned at the intersection of history and philosophy of medicine, I'm particularly interested in the connection between such inequalities and the implicit and explicit choices of what the search for knowledge targets. And one of the most interesting analytic frameworks to think about this intertwining is that of epistemic injustice. So the term goes back to Miranda Fricker, a philosopher who proposed epistemic injustice in 2003. Initially, she exemplified the concept with regard to testimonial injustice. In Fricker's terms, this is the phenomenon when a speaker receives the wrong degree of credibility from his hearer owing to a certain sort of unintended prejudice on the hearer's part. So it's a quote from Fricker 2003. And in the past 2 decades, epistemic injustice has become a major theme in social epistemology. And the concept was broadened, refined, and subtyped in order to examine how power, prejudice, and a lack of sensibility to the experience of others leads to, and this is a quote by Kidd and Medina, wrongful treatment and unjust structures in meaning-making and knowledge-producing practices. So what I would like to discuss with you is how this concept might be incorporated into historical research. I do think that the history of ageism can be told as the history of an epistemic injustice, though as usual, when history comes in, it also adds a layer of complexity to the philosophy. And this brings me to the complicated relationship of ageism and medicine. I want to talk about 3 aspects of this relationship. So first, as the WHO stresses in its definition of ageism as an insidious practice, ageism in society causes medical problems for older adults. This includes structural as well as individual negative effects. Care and research in geriatric medicine are substantially underfunded compared to other fields of medicine. The highest incidence of suicide among men in the US is in the age range of over 75 years. According to the CDC, it was in 2018 almost 40 per 100,000 people. In women of the same age, it was only 4 per 100,000, and one cause for this discrepancy is in the starker social segregation that old men experience. So second to this causal relationship between negative health outcomes due to ageism is that the concept of ageism actually has medical roots. And I will explain that now in the next 7 minutes or so. So ageism is nowadays applied widely as an analytic term in cultural studies, but the terminology emerged within a medical debate. debate. So Robert Neal Butler, who lived from 1927 to 2010, was a doctor, and his 1969 paper on ageism, another form of bigotry, was published in the medical journal, The Gerontologist. Of course, Butler was a child of his time, and sociologists such as Milton Barron proposed already in 1953 the quasi-minority group status of the aged. However, as historian Jesse Bellinger has pointed out, Butler's approach was new in that he used the civil rights movement of the 1960s to frame ageism, not just as a theoretical framework, but as a political problem. And other intellectuals discussed age and discriminatory societal attitudes against the aged, also from an activist perspective. So think, for instance, of Simone de Beauvoir. Yet, what is particularly interesting about Butler's role in this is what he advocates for, and that's what I want to look at now. So Butler was in his early 40s in 1968 and worked as psychiatrist and gerontologist in Washington, D.C. He specialized on dementia. And a few years after his ageism paper in 1975, he became known as Pulitzer Prize winner for his book, Why Survive? Being Old in America, and in the same year was made inaugural director of the National Institute on Aging. The National Institute on Aging has contributed enormously to research funding into dementia, and particularly on Alzheimer's disease, and I will return to that. But now let me stress the argumentative structure of Butler's paper. So notably, his point of departure were not so much the medical problems of the elderly, but the prejudices against elderly and especially older poor people of color. In his paper, he describes how the local middle class and middle-aged white citizenry appeared at hearings of the Public Housing Agency of the District of Columbia to argue against the setting up of a housing project for the elderly poor in their neighborhood called Chevy Chase. So Butler writes, quote, "Neighborhood reaction against the use of Regency House for the elderly poor carries implications beyond Chevy Chase. Ageism reflects a deep-seated uneasiness on the part of the young and middle-aged, a personal revulsion to and distaste for growing old, disease, disability, and fear of powerlessness, uselessness, and death. Cultural attitudes in our society reinforce these feelings," unquote. So he links these negative feelings to many detrimental effects, including social segregation and, importantly, distributive injustice of research allocation. He suggests a correlation between ageism in society and the underfunding of medical research into age-related health issues, for which he demands more money. Butler speaks of, and this is again a quote, "the probable inequities in the allocation of research funds. Although persons 65 years of age and over account for 25% of all public mental hospital admissions, only 3% of the research budget of the National Institute of Mental Health is spent in relevant research. Less than 1% of the budget of the entire National Institutes of Health is devoted to the study of aging phenomena," unquote. But how exactly would more medical research into the study of aging phenomena counteract ageism? Critical cultural historians have argued that the underlying political philosophy of Butler's ageism was neoliberal. Medicine should help old people to successfully age, that is to say, get old without developing age-related diseases, bodily and mental decay. For instance, Jesse Bellinger writes about, quote, "the liberal attack that the work of Butler exemplifies. Despite its wish to assert the dignity of the elderly in their own right, it cannot shake the accusations that it simply demands old people to be young," unquote. So this brings us to the heart of the complicated relationship between medicine and ageism. Beyond the implications of ageism on health and the medical roots of the concept, there is a third kind of relationship between medicine and ageism. Medicine can contribute to ageism. So medical anthropologists like Margaret Lock and other social scientists and critical gerontologists have discussed this aspect with respect to the recent history of Alzheimer's disease. The argument goes that the negative stereotypes of aging, such as being non-autonomous and a burden to others, were being increasingly connected to the public image of a particular disease, Alzheimer's disease. In the last decades of the 20th century, this disease became more and more of a public health problem in a double respect. For one, the diagnostic criteria changed to include more than 3/4 of all dementia diagnoses. And for another, the media coverage of prominent sufferers of Alzheimer's disease, such as former President Ronald Reagan, gave the disease a public image, not just causing disease awareness, but also evoking fear. The Alzheimer's Association wrote in their 2019 report that 82% of old people in the US would wish to have their memory and cognition regularly monitored. So is the history of ageism a history of epistemic injustice? Butler's rhetoric fits well to the analytic framework, especially in terms of distributive injustice. But the repercussions of Butler's anti-ageist research agenda also show that the argument of ageism has been used to fund researchers and not necessarily to give more voice to the people who are faced with ageism. And this career of Alzheimer's research was no coincidence. In the 1970s, after President Nixon announced the $100 million war on cancer, the hunt for research money to fight age-related diseases gained momentum. In 1976, the New York neurologist and later director and successor of Butler of the National Institute on Aging, Bob Katzman, advocated for including Alzheimer's disease as one of the top 5 causes for death in the official statistics. So he wrote a paper called Alzheimer's Disease, the Major Killer. These statistics were used to lobby for more money, and in the Reagan era, less successfully for more public funding of care for the elderly poor, but quite successfully for biomedical research programs. Old age was no longer a marker for senility, but became the most important risk factor for developing dementia. So the question that interests me is, how is the use of age as a risk factor then connected to ageism? Let us again look at the corona crisis. On the one hand, we can see that there are conjunctures. For instance, the connection between behavior that is associated with the youth and the assignment of people into groups of a specific age range and the contagious path of the coronavirus. And all of that contributes to negative reservations of older people against young people. And just because it's relevant for this example, let me briefly note that Butler actually already noted in his polemical paper that and that's the last quote from him, ageism is also seen in other groups. The young may not trust anyone over 30, but those over 30 may not trust anyone younger. Future historians may find in the political year 1968 the elements of a counter-revolution by the middle-aged against both the young and the old, unquote. As a side note, I would really love to read a history of the persona of the future historian. But back to ageism. So while there are conjunctures to old prejudices on the one hand, on the other hand, there are deep epistemological differences between equalizing age with disease and assessing age as a risk factor. And in the last few minutes, I want to locate one of these differences in the shifting of the foundations of medicine from case-based to population-based knowledge. And this actually connects quite nicely with Aparna's talk, also with respect to like the longer precedents that she has worked out of the concept of population in medicine. But here I want to look at some shifts that we can currently see. So the population concept has become more and more important within medicine in the past 3 or 4 decades. And I would even argue that the stratification of a population is about to become more important than the classification of disease, at least in medical research. So this brings me to ageism in the era of stratification. So the term stratification is used in various scientific contexts to capture phenomena or practices of layering. Within statistics, it describes, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the division of a heterogeneous population into non-overlapping homogeneous groups so that each may be sampled independently and these samples combined to form one of the entire population. So with the advent of statistical methods in clinical epidemiology in the second half of the 20th century, and in particular in evidence-based medicine in the 1990s, the population has become a key medical target of analysis. Personalized or precision medicine promises to bring population-based knowledge to the individual. I think we need to take this into account when historicizing ageism. So we can say that ageism avant la lettre might have pointed to senility, that is to say, the widely held belief that old age aligns with decay. We can see it like already in the 19th century. Ageism in the 1960s and 70s was used as a political formula to create awareness for distributive injustice, to advocate for more money, to counter age-related disease. And ageism in the era of stratification is more hidden because it is in a way completely naturalized. Age is scripted as an objective variable of a stratified dataset. And here I want to point out that the medical individual of precision medicine is very different from the so-called case. The case refers to the individual patient record with which physicians have thought in early modern and modern medicine. But in the era of stratification, the individual is disassembled into different variables that can be put in alignment to population-based big data sets. On these grounds, precision medicine attempts to provide information that is specific for the individual with respect to risk profile, prognosis, and therapeutic outcomes. It does not only work on a different understanding of the medical individual, but also aims at replacing the categorical classification of diseases with stratified states of health and disease. And we can be quite critical about achieving just healthcare through precision medicine, yet we need to acknowledge the fact that stratification practices have become fundamental for late modern medicine. The practice of defining risk groups according to health state and age has, of course, much older precedents, as Aparna has also pointed to. Within current practices of stratification, the concept of age is less monolithic. Age is not a marker of disease tout court. Rather, age is a metadata variable in medical research enterprises. Age is analyzed as a potential correlate for pathological processes, whereas the correlation is mostly explained in terms of a risk factor, that is to say, an elevated probability to develop the pathology in question. So it is important to trace the shifting epistemological foundations of medicine to understand mixtures between old and new functions of age and forms of ageism, I would like to conclude. I've sketched some of these mixtures with respect to Alzheimer research and anti-corona measures to show that the conjunction of knowledge and injustice raises questions that we can study historically. We can trace how classical prejudices against certain age groups have re-emerged in parallel to the use of age as a stratification variable in epidemiology. We can point the finger at the prejudices, but I hope to have shown that we also need to look at the sampling methods and the understanding of the individual person, of risk, disease, and validity that they are tied to. And I look forward to continuing that when I move to the MPI next year. And this is also a bit of an invitation that everyone who's kind of like interested in these topics as well, please feel free to write me an email, and I'm very happy to continue this next year. And now I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of the speakers, for setting the stage here for discussion. I'd like to invite you both to turn the microphones off and let you freely associate with one another for the next, say, 15 minutes, and we'll see how the questions queue up in the Etherpad. Meanwhile, please, everybody else, feel free to take a look at that and sign up or write out your questions. And Aparna, if I'm not mistaken, you have written about Alzheimer's in the past as well. So it seems like you may have both a lot to say to one another. So
yeah, although my work isn't along the lines of Lara's, my grandmother died of Alzheimer's in India about 3 years ago, and I worked with an artist to write a brief description of some of the aspects of the experience of Alzheimer's for families and for her, using the graphic novel format. So it's like 6 pages, and it's still with the editors of the volume, and I really hope it gets published. But there's been some really there's already some wonderful work on Alzheimer's in India. If I forget his name, Lawrence. Yeah. It has mangoes in the title. That's all I remember. White saris and something mangoes. Yes. It's a beautifully written book on it's an ethnographic exploration of aging in India, and it's becoming a consistently more important issue in South India at least, which is aging much faster than North India, which is younger. Kerala, for instance, the average life expectancy is about 78 now, so there's a significant population of elderly. And social understandings of some responsibility of care and community and family are very different. But we are seeing more Alzheimer's patients in, yeah. So it is very different from Lara's work.
So please feel free to ask one another some questions and perhaps find some connections, nonetheless, despite the differences. So love to hear what those might be.
Yeah, might I ask a question? I would be quite interested in like what you said at the end about disability informed bioethics. So because I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about is really like also how these disciplinary boundaries shift perhaps in a quicker pace at the moment, just because more people make this experience of being affected. And I know that you have also written about what like your own standpoint makes for your research. So I would be really interested in what you've drawn from that academically, but also in how far you think that at the moment there might be something that also shifts in academia with respect to that.
I sincerely hope that's the case, because disability studies scholars and disability historians have been arguing about the need for disability-centric bioethics for a very long time now. This is not new, but in the context of the pandemic, I think the need became especially acute. And I don't know if you read Ezekiel Emanuel et al.'s paper on the, which was published, I think, in JAMA, and it was an examination of how resources would be dispersed in the context of, a crisis in hospitals. And what was really striking about that is that there were all the established philosophical standpoints in bioethics, but none from disability studies. What is really problematic for most people in disability studies who read this is that this is a population that is significantly impacted by what bioethicists toy with as ideas, and yet is a very vocal population and disability studies is a discipline that's been around since the 80s at the very least, and yet there's very little interest in learning from disability studies informed bioethics. There's scholarship on the matter. There are critiques of existing medical ethics and bioethics. The number of, if you take the US, for instance, there are very few medical schools that have disability studies scholars on their, who teach on their staff. They don't see it as valuable. And it's kind of terrifying to me to think about physicians who have so much power over the bodies and lives and of disabled people and of the elderly who don't see disability in any other way other than a problem to be fixed or a burden on the healthcare system, or in terms of costs, right? Mm-hmm. So fundamentally, disability studies humanizes, these narratives. We acknowledge that in crisis, resources will be scarce and these decisions have to be made. But you also need to have feedback in disability advocates, you should have lawyers and community members on ethics boards as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is really interesting. And I think that's also something that through, like, for instance, through this framework of epistemic injustice, I think has come much more into the philosophical debate, right? That people kind of acknowledge that it really matters who speaks for which group, and that it's kind of like pointless to discuss about issues where the people who are concerned with them are not heard, right? But it's kind of like, I think it's interesting to see how these theoretical frameworks and what is happening on, like, in the real world, how they actually impact on each other.
Yeah, I mean, the only real maybe small spark of is that I really notice, at least in some parts of academia, there is an interest that they've realized that disability studies exist, that it has something to offer. And while I'm bitter about that, I'm also happy to, I'm bitter that it's taken them this long to understand that disability matters. That's, it's, again, it's been around for more than 40 years now. So I hope it changes. I'm seeing a lot more jobs advertised in disability studies, critical disability studies, intersections with race and indigeneity, gender. So, but I would like to see medical schools actually hiring disability studies scholars who work on law and ethics and have them teach medical students. I teach, students here who are headed to medical school, and I can tell you, they need disability studies. They have this notion of medicine as heroic and transformative and objective and fundamentally positive. And it's scary that they don't really understand the broader histories and problematic roles that biomedicine has played in scientific racism in the US, for instance, or in the forced institutionalization of disabled people, the mass sterilization programs. So, yeah. But I was also really struck by your mention of, I actually took down notes on that when you were talking about how, I was thinking about the overlaps between ageism and ableism scholarship. There's this conclusion consistently that many disability studies scholars have raised, that the disabled body actually evokes disgust and the emotion that many people feel when they confront a disabled body is disgust, right? But there's also that fear that the disabled body represents what lies in wait for us. And that's exactly where I think ableism and ageism intersect, because there's this atavistic fear that many people have, even if we don't acknowledge it to ourselves, that through accident, injury, or aging, we will become one of the disabled. So
that's I think this emotional aspect is quite important, and also like the question from what perspective it is uttered, right? And I mean, there's quite interesting work also on the phenomenology of illness, for instance, by Javi Carrel, who has really made that point also with respect to like that, disability, disease, health, well-being, happiness are like, they do not easily connect to each other, and that there's like this paradox that people think who are not concerned with disability, that disabled people or ill people must be more unhappy, what often is not the case, right? And I think all of these things, also what you have been talking about, why it's important to have disability studies in medical schools, I think really important to kind of also show how different these ideas of what medical progress actually might be, how different we can actually kind of think about that, and also think about like big programs, for instance, of the WHO, right? This goal, health for all, to think about what could that actually mean, what is, and what are like the whose voices are heard there, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are some really powerful and necessary critiques of global health in general and international health, which make the argument that it is still reproducing colonial era, inequalities. And right now, I think we're able to see that in the likelihood that it's going to take, what was it, until 2024 for some parts of the world to actually be fully vaccinated. So my parents are in India, and there's no sign of rollout yet. And I keep thinking to myself that, yeah, global health just reproduces very many of the old colonial divides in many ways without really thinking about it. And the World Health Organization and other international agencies are all part of that system.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Coyk and Nair, for joining us today. We really look forward to reading more about your research, and about the new work that you'll be doing, and trailblazing the way forward for many of us. And everybody in the audience, thank you so much for joining us as well. We will take a winter break now and reconvene in 2021 on March 23rd. And we will be having a topic on environments and ecologies of transmission. And we'll be joined by Drs. Nicole De Paula, Dr. Nuket Varlik, and Dr. Christos Linteris. And we'll be looking more deeply at the issue of zoonosis, sustainability, and the history of environment. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Have a safe and happy, healthy winter.